Cursor is a code editor similar to VS Code that helps you code much faster with the help of AI. Now, even if you don't have any coding experience, it can still help you build basic programs and help you learn how to code along the way. And if you have a lot of experience like me, it can dramatically boost the speed at which you write your code, and it can work on large code bases as well. I made a similar tutorial about 6 months ago, so in AI timescales, that's about 10 years, so it was time to create another one because a lot of things have changed and there's a completely new workflow that you should use to get the most out of the tool today. So let's start with the basics. First, you're going to want to go to cursor.com and you can download the tool. Cursor is a desktop application, so it's going to run on your computer and it's going to work on the files on your computer. It doesn't run in the browser like some other tools. You can get started for free, and the free plan does include a 2-week-long pro trial, so I suggest you start with that and then see if it's worth your time. For me personally, it saves me an absolute ton of time, so it's an easy investment. Once you have Cursor downloaded and installed, you can open it up and you'll see a window similar to this. Cursor is based on VS Code, so if you're already familiar with that, feel free to skip along, but for those who are just starting out, I'm going to go through the various panels and what they're responsible for. First, you're going to want to open a project, and this is just going to be a folder on your computer where you want the code to be. You can feel free to just create an empty folder. Then you will see something like this. And the first thing I'm going to do is open a terminal, which I'll explain in a moment. So this is what the full layout looks like. Now I'll switch over to a project where I already have some code. So let's go through these panels. First up at the top, you have various menus, and these are going to allow you to do lots of different stuff. The most important one I would say is under File, Preferences, and Cursor Settings and VS Code Settings. These are going to allow you to configure how Cursor actually works. Now on the left, we have the File Explorer, and this is basically just looking at the folder on your computer and allowing you to quickly navigate across different files. You can add files, you can add folders, and you can see which editors you have open, but I'm just going to close all of those, and here we go. Now we just have one open. Speaking of which, this middle panel is going to show you the contents of the file that you're viewing. And right now I'm viewing this app.tsx file. You can see all of the different code. And when I make changes here, you'll see various things like autocomplete and suggestions. And you'll also be able to use some of the AI features that Cursor has in here by being able to select some code and pressing Control-K. I'll cover that as well as all of the other coding features once we get through all these panels. So in the bottom here, which I opened using terminal, new terminal, I have the terminal, which is allowing me to execute commands on my computer. And you can actually also use AI in here by pressing Control-K and describing the sort of command you want to run. This is going to be helpful for you to actually run the code that you write. There are some other tabs here, but honestly, I don't really use them. I just use the terminal. Sometimes you'll want a new one, so I just like to press this button over here to add a new terminal, and then you can run multiple things at the same time. And finally, over here on the right, we have the AI chat panel, and this is essentially like ChatGPT, but baked into the code editor, so it's going to be aware of all of the files that you have, and it'll be able to make changes across all of them. This is what I think makes Cursor much better for coding than tools like ChatGPT, because it's going to be able to automatically find the right files and make updates inside of them instead of requiring you to kind of piece together every change that it makes. And this is the most important panel because this is where the majority of your interactions with the Cursor AI will actually happen. In fact, let's take a closer look at this panel and see what's going on here. So first, of course, you have the input box, which allows you to write prompts to get the AI to either answer questions or write some code. Up here, you have the ability to add additional context that the AI will consider when processing your request. Down here in the bottom left, you have a drop-down for the mode. Now, up until recently, it was actually quite a bit more confusing what you should do because there was a composer menu and you could choose between normal and agent, but now everything is handled through this mode drop-down. So now things are a lot more simplified, and essentially you just want to use agent whenever you're trying to make changes to your code, and you want to use ask whenever you're trying to design something or just asking questions about your code. Now to the right of that, you have the model dropdown, and the thing to keep in mind is that Cursor is a tool sitting on top of the AI models. They do have some models of their own that they use for things like autocomplete, but the majority of the code is actually generated using state-of-the-art AI models from companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. Personally, I've found the best model for coding is Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and I know a lot of professional developers share that opinion. Anthropic recently came out with a new model called Claude 3.7 Sonnet, but my initial impression is that this model likes to over-engineer and write too much unnecessary code, so I found myself still gravitating towards 3.5 Sonnet instead. Time will tell, and maybe things will improve with 3.7, but for now, I like to use 3.5. You also have the ability to add images here to use as a reference. And of course, you have your chat history and the ability to create a new chat. Now let's go ahead and actually write some code using Cursor. I have an empty project open over here. I'm going to go over here to the chat panel. And if this isn't open, all you have to do is press Control or Command L, and it's going to open up the panel. So I'm actually going to use my voice to type my prompt. And you can do this without any specialized software. On a Mac, just press the function key twice, and on a Windows, press Windows H. Please create a basic landing page using React and Tailwind. I'll just specify that I want to use Vite here, and we're going to switch it over to agent mode, and go ahead and send that request. Okay, so here we're seeing the first capability of the Cursor agent, which is the ability for it to run commands. This is a command that we would typically run in the terminal to initialize this project. And I'm going to go ahead and just click Run Command. There's actually a setting called YOLO mode, which you can get by going to File, Preferences, Cursor Settings, and under Features, you'll see it here. And YOLO mode actually will allow Cursor to automatically run these commands instead of you having to approve it every time. Although I think in most cases, you do still want to see what the command is before you run it. We'll go ahead and accept this one as well. Okay, looks like it ran into an error, and you can see that it actually automatically recovered itself. This is another strength of the Cursor agents. They can identify when they have a problem, and then they try a different approach. Since we ran this command up here to create a project using Vite, we actually see a bunch of files automatically created. So this is the majority of our starter React project. And now what we're seeing is the Cursor agent actually creating additional files and automatically populating them with some code. So this file right here, tailwindconfig.js, was just written by Cursor. Now we see that it went ahead and actually modified our app.tsx file. And when we go to the file, you'll see these red areas, which are lines of code that it removed, and these greenish yellow lines, which are code that it has added. Now, if we wanted to, we could go through and we could actually approve this one by one, but usually you're best off just accepting the whole file and then iterating from there in case there are further changes that you want to make. All right, so it looks like it's kind of done writing code, and it's saying that we should just do npm run dev, which is the command to actually start this React application. I'm going to run it over here in the terminal just so that it's running outside of this chat. I'll just go ahead and copy this command, and then we'll run it here. All right, now we have this application running, and I'll open it, and here's what it looks like. Now, obviously, it's a little bit of a mess. I don't know why these icons are so huge, but this actually gives us a good opportunity to ask the AI agent to make further changes to the code. And we're going to do that in the same chat because that will allow it to see the context of what it's done so far, and it will know what we are talking about. I ran the command directly in the terminal, and the application is up and running. However, there are some issues, like the icons are really huge. I think it might be a problem having to do with Tailwind and the styles not being properly applied. Can you please troubleshoot and figure out why the icons might be so large? And then I'll just go ahead and submit that. So now the Cursor agent has removed a bunch of the CSS responsible for the styling, and now it's reading this CSS file and asking us to delete that. Sure, let's go ahead. All right, so we've deleted the file, and it's made some style changes to the app.tsx. Okay, let's flip back over here. Well, that actually looks kind of worse. So what I'm going to do is show you another feature, which is the ability to go back to a previous version of your code. You can always go back to a previous message that you had and click this Restore Checkpoint button, which is going to undo the changes and basically take you back to the version of the code that you had when you sent that message. So now when I go back to the UI, you see it's that previous version. One thing that I noticed is that this is underlined in yellow and it says unknown rule at Tailwind. I'm actually going to try this right here, which is fix in chat, and we're going to see if it can actually figure out why the error happens. And it looks like it figured out that we need this post CSS file. Let's restart the server and see if that makes a difference. Now when I refresh, okay, it gives me another error. I'm actually just going to go ahead and paste this directly back into the chat, and you don't even really need to add any context. Cursor will tend to just figure it out. Okay, we got another package that we need to install. After going back and forth a few more times with the AI agent, I was able to figure out the issue and install the proper packages. Now the landing page looks like this. Now let's go ahead and add a little game to our application. I'm going to actually open a new chat, and you want to do this anytime you're working on a new feature. Think of it like this. Every time you send a message in a chat that already has messages in it, that is additional context that is going to the AI model. And that can be useful if you're trying to iterate on something that is relevant, but if you're building something new, it's actually going to distract the model and you'll end up with worse performance overall. So generally speaking, when you have a new feature, you want to start a new chat. The nice thing is, if you do have something that you've been working on for a while and you need a new chat to kind of refresh the context, Cursor has also added a new feature that allows you to start a new chat with a summary of a previous chat. I found this helps when you're working on a really big feature and you kind of want a fresh start, but you still want a lot of the context from that previous conversation. But in this case, I'm just going to start a brand new chat, and we're going to ask the AI to add a game of Snake to our landing page. Use a separate file to contain that logic. I'll submit that request, and what we'll see now is that Cursor is going to create a new file for us that has this Snake game, and it will automatically update this app.tsx file so that the Snake game is included in there. This is the beautiful thing about AI agents nowadays. You don't even really need to tag all of the relevant context, and you don't need to have all of the files created. The AI agents will just go and create the necessary files and find and update any other files that they need to change. So in this case, we see that Cursor is importing the Snake game in the app file, and we can see the Snake game over here. This is a brand new file. Now if I go and refresh the page, we can scroll down and start the game. Okay, well, it looks like the Snake game is working, but whenever I press up and down, it is moving my window. So let me go ahead and ask Cursor to change that. The Snake game is working well, but whenever I press up or down, the scroll bar on the main window seems to shift as well. Can you make sure that we are preventing that from happening? And this is the sort of workflow that you'll generally use. You'll make an initial request, Cursor will write some code, and then you'll see some problems with it. What you want to do is tell Cursor what it did correctly and what changes it still needs to make. That way it's not going to rewrite and modify a bunch of stuff that's already working, and it'll focus its energy on just the changes that you still need. Okay, let's refresh this. We'll try it again. There we go. And now when I press up and down, it's no longer moving the screen. Now the other thing you can do with this AI panel is ask questions about your code. Let's try that here. I'm going to actually highlight this function over here, and I'm just going to add it to chat. So it's additional context that's being passed in so that Cursor knows what we're asking about. Please explain this code line by line. We'll submit that, and this can actually be a really great way to learn how to code while you're getting AI to write the code, because when you're asking questions, Cursor is going to know the context in which you're asking them. So here we see an explanation of the code that is running here. This code uses a useEffect hook, which runs whenever the snake's position or food position changes. And if I'm a beginner learning how to code, I can just ask follow-up questions. So explain useEffect in more detail and what a canvas is. So this is the sort of thing that you would use the ask mode for, is to learn about the code, and you can also use it to design things. So if I go over to app.tsx, you'll see that it changes the context over here as I switch between the files. This is the additional context that's being sent alongside your question. So in this case, we want to ask about app, and I'll just do a design sort of question. Let's say we wanted to add a bunch of different games to the system and we wanted to add multiplayer functionality. How would you design this? And in this case, I actually used Sonnet 3.7 thinking because it does a pretty good job at these high-level designs and thinking through all of the details. And in this case, we can see the core architecture, how we would handle the game registry, multiplayer infrastructure, and so on. So we see kind of an overall design. Let me ask it to summarize this in a more bullet point list. So here we go. Here's the design and the file structure that we would use. So this is another powerful way to use the ask mode in Cursor. Now let's go back to using the Cursor agent to make some further code changes, but I'm actually going to switch gears and work on a different application that has a much more developed code base. This way I can show you how to use Cursor in a real-world application and how to properly manage context, as well as some of the more advanced tools. The application I'm working on is called Elderrune, and it is basically an AI-powered note-taking app. So here we have our notes and groups of notes, and the thing that we want to add is another tab here that has chats. Right now we have a chat history over here on the right, but we want to bring it over here to notes and groups and be able to put our chats into folders. So going beyond the simple demos, this is a feature that you would actually build in a real-world application. So I'll switch over to Cursor, and I'm going to use 3.5 Sonnet agent mode. And in this case, I'm going to type my prompt because I'm going to be tagging specific files that I want Cursor to focus on. We currently have @ and this is going to allow me to tag a file. So in this case, I'm going to say notes panel, which is this panel right here on the left, and groups panel, which both use the folder tree view. Now I've tagged multiple files. I can actually go ahead and click on them to quickly navigate to them. But what I want to ask Cursor to do is follow the structure of these files to create a new chats panel file. So the full prompt is we currently have notes panel and groups panel, which both use the folder tree view, and we want to create a new chats panel file. We may need to modify server.com, which is a file I use for integrating with my backend, and our server logic in main.ts to support this. So what I'm doing here is actually asking Cursor to implement a full stack feature across all of the layers. So I gave it some examples for the UI code that it needs to replicate, and then I gave it a file to modify the API integration, and then I gave it the file that contains my backend server. So as you'll see, Cursor is able to take all of that context and modify the relevant files. So tagging files to include them in the context is going to be your most powerful tool for directing the Cursor agent to make sure that it focuses on the relevant code. Okay, so it's making some changes. It created a chats panel, made some changes to the integration. It also modified the server, but you'll see here it got 2 linter errors, which are essentially errors with the structure of the code. And what the agent can do is actually just automatically identify these errors and then modify the file further. In this case, it looks like it finished the feature, but it missed these 2 errors. So I'm just going to ask it to please check for lint errors. Okay, we see it continuing to iterate, and it can actually make changes multiple times. So in this case, it modified this file 3 times before it worked through all of the errors. Okay, so now it made changes to all of these files. I can actually review them using this little toolbar. So in this case, I can go down and see the changes that it made. Looks like it added a couple of different endpoints here. And I can go to the next file. And in here, it looks like we have an error. So I'll kind of note that down. Got some types. Got some new integrations. Okay, so I notice a couple of errors in the code. I'm going to go ahead and explain what I'm seeing. So I said, I think we also need to update, a couple of other files to include the chats type, and let's add this panel to the left sidebar. So as you see, I'm iterating on this code through this chat. I'm not just expecting it to be correct on the first go. It wrote a bunch of code. That's great. It's a starting point. Now I'm going to continue using the chat and reviewing the code to make sure that it actually works as I expect. So if you start using Cursor and it's running into a bunch of errors, that's perfectly normal. You just have to continue to iterate until you work through those. The agent is continuing to do some work, and you'll see it periodically do things like searching for additional files, reading files, and these features are just built into the Cursor agents now, so you don't even need to tag all of the relevant files. But it does help when you're working in a large code base. So after some additional iteration, I finally got the feature working, and now we have a fully functional chats panel over here. And as I navigate through the different chats, we can see them pop up on the right, and I can create a new one with this button. I'll continue to refine the feature, but you get the gist of how you can continue to iterate with the AI agent until you get it working just the way you want. I'm back here in our starter app now to talk about some of the other context options that you have inside of Cursor. Now we've talked about adding files to the context of the chat by using the @ symbol, but you can also add other types of context, such as documentation. Cursor has a bunch of default documentation built in, so we can actually type in @docs, and then you can select various official documentation that you want to use. So if I wanted to use OpenAI, for example, I can simply tag that, and then Cursor would be aware of that documentation. This means I don't have to go on the web and find it on my own and copy paste things. Cursor is able to automatically just use that. Now, if there is no official documentation, Cursor also has the ability to accept links, and it will be able to follow them and read through them. So if there's a GitHub issue, for example, talking about how to implement a certain fix, you could simply copy paste that link in here and then ask Cursor to implement that. And finally, you can actually just ask Cursor to do the searching on its own by using the @web context. This will cause Cursor to actually perform that web search and then answer our questions. So I'll just say, use the latest Anthropic API to add a chatbot to our app, and I'll tag @web so it should be able to find the latest code. Here we go. We see a bunch of different references that it found, and here it generated some code for us, but we're in the ask mode, so it didn't immediately apply it to my files. Now, one final context option I want to talk about is the ability to use images. So in this case, I looked up landing page design, and I like the way that this one looks, so I'll just copy it. We'll paste it in here. There's our image, and I'll just ask, please modify the application so that it appears more like the landing page in the attached image. I'll make sure to use the agent mode, and we'll make that request. Okay, it's made some changes, so going over to the UI, well, it looks a little bit more like that image, although there are some issues, so I'd obviously iterate on this, but you get the idea. So those are the main ways that I like to manage context: tagging files, @docs, @web, URLs, and images. There are other pieces of context which you can tag, but those are the ones that I tend to use the most. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the AI agent, and that's with good reason, because that's what you'll be using 90% of the time. But I do want to highlight some of the other ways that AI is embedded into Cursor so you can see the additional options that you have. First of all, you can still code directly by hand. I know it's kind of hard to believe in 2025, but if I wanted to make changes over here, and let's say I wanted to add another tab, you can see that Cursor actually suggests code automatically for me. And so in this case, I'm just going to press tab, and it's going to apply that code that it suggested. Now if I press enter, it has another recommendation for me. So I can press tab, and here we go. Now we have a few additional tabs on our UI. When we refresh, you can see them over here in the top right. This autocomplete is actually very powerful, and we can do some more advanced things here. Like, let's just create a new div. We'll just call it left panel, and you can see that it's making changes across a number of lines right away. And here I'll just manually type right panel, tab, 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 and now we have these links spread across these two different divs. It's a small thing, but it can be really helpful, especially if you don't remember particular property names. So if I wanted this to be flex column, but I don't remember what it is, you can see the autocomplete is just going to figure that out for me. And I'll show you one more thing, which is the inline code editor. I don't find myself using this very often, but it's good to know. If you press Control or Command K while selecting some code, you can ask for very specific code changes to direct that code. I don't use this very often because I just find that I'm much more efficient relying on the AI agent to make changes across a bunch of different files instead of making very small changes to just a few lines of code. Another great use of AI in Cursor is the ability to use it to generate commands. So if I don't remember how to start a project, for example, I can just press Command K and say something like create new Vite React project. And it's actually going to generate the command that I can run directly in the terminal here. So this can be a really useful way to write your command if you don't remember the exact syntax. Now I just want to mention a couple of other Cursor features. I don't tend to use them very often, but they are good to know. The first is that Cursor listens to the .gitignore file and will avoid adding any of the files listed here to its context window. So if you have sensitive environmental variables, for example, you probably want to include that in the .gitignore, They also listen to a file called .cursorignore, but since gitignore already exists in a lot of repositories, I just use that. But there's another file that is specific to Cursor that Cursor listens to, and that is the cursor rules file. So if I go here and I create it, .cursor rules, anything that I put in here, Cursor is going to listen and add to its context whenever it does anything. So in here, I'll just say, talk like you're a playful witch. One thing I realized is you actually need to have this file in the root directory of your folder. So let me try asking it again. What is this file doing? Cackles and adjusts pointy hat. Okay, so you can see it's following the cursor rules now. This can be useful if you have a very particular way of doing things, or if you want the AI to follow a specific instruction every single time. I personally don't use a cursor rules file because I find that every request I make is different, and there's nothing that I want to add to the context of every single request that I make. But there are people who really value the cursor rules file and really customize it. So it can be good for things like if you want to do test-driven development, for example, and you want Cursor to write all of your tests first and then implement a feature. Using cursor rules would make sense in that sort of use case. One other advanced Cursor feature I want to mention is MCPs, and this is a new concept that Anthropic created. Basically, it's a standard protocol for AI agents and AI tools to use so that you can hook up tools like Cursor to other data sources. So an MCP server defines various endpoints that a Cursor agent or another AI agent would be able to call to either retrieve or submit data to that system. It's a pretty new concept, but it shows a lot of promise, and I've already seen some MCPs with the ability to, for example, pull all of the logs in your browser and send them into Cursor, which makes that whole troubleshooting loop a lot more seamless. So I think we could really start to see these MCP tools take off. But right now it's a pretty new development, and so there's not a lot of expertise in the area just yet. Now that Cursor agents can actually write most of your code for you, the thing that becomes super important is knowing how to word your prompts. After spending over 1,000 hours coding with AI, I've put all of my best insights and tips into this video, so make sure to check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Take care.